Architecture Fund, and the generous support of Frank Sciame, 74, CEO of Sciame Construction. So as is our wont, we begin with a land acknowledgement, stating that the Spitzer School of Architecture, grounded on the schist bedrock outcrop of Harlem, is situated upon the ancestral homeland and territory of the Munsee Lenape, Wappinger, and Waquasajet peoples. As members of an educational community, we are obliged to know the histories of dispossession that have allowed the City College of New York to grow and thrive on this vibrant terrain. As designers and thinkers, we endeavor to build in ways that tend toward lead toward justice. And we are committed to working to dismantling the ongoing consequences of settler colonialism. So I'd like to ask my colleague and dear friend, the chair of the architecture department, Sean Weiss, to come to the podium and introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Welcome. I hope everyone's having a good evening. I'm Sean Weiss, the chair of the architecture department, as most of you know. Before I introduce our distinguished guest speaker this evening, I just want to make an announcement to those of you licensed architects out there. We have the NYSID continuing education credit set up right outside to the left. And thanks to Jason for helping us set that up. So you can sign up on your way out. So the main reason I'm here is to welcome and introduce our guest. I need my reading glasses, which I don't have, so you're going to have to excuse me for a second. CJ Alvarez is author of Borderland, Border Water, A History of Construction on the U.S. Mexico Divide, the first broad sweeping history of building projects on the border. He's currently writing a book about the history of the Chihuahuan Desert, the largest and least known desert in North America. He grew up in Las Cruces, New Mexico, studied art history at Stanford and Harvard, and I'm also an art historian, at least at the undergrad level as you. And he received a doctorate in history from the University of Chicago. He is currently an associate professor in the Department of Mexican American and Latina and Latino Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. So I've been reading your work because I mentioned your book and your articles in the past couple of days. And when you're really excited about someone's work, you start writing a book review when you're in our field. So I all of a sudden, I can't steal your thunder or say something that you're going to say much more eloquently. So I'll just say very briefly that I was particularly taken with the ways in which our speaker kind of narrates this transnational history along the U.S. Mexico border through this kind of longue durée that stretches back to the 19th century. And interprets this history through a kind of through an optic of environmental history. He looks, which I really appreciate, at bureaucracies, among other things, whose traces we can find in the large engineering projects through the kind of material relations between people, water, concrete, chain link, and barbed wire. So with that, I welcome our speaker and very much looking forward.
Make one interruption.
To your presentation. Yes.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done this before. I'm absent-minded. The absent-minded professor sticks with me, but I do want to welcome to this group our two new staff members to introduce you to Jason Garcia, the Director of Operations here at Spitzer, and Nick Smith, my new executive assistant. So I apologize. I should have done that before. I don't mean, anyway. Introduced. And now, CJ, please.
Well,
thank you, Sean. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Camille and Jason and Nell, the support staff who helped me get me out here and set me up. Just start my time right here. Then we can really get into it. Where's my cursor? Oh, there it is. Okay, we're in business. So, I'm a long way from home. I came a long way out of my natural habitat and my environment to be here. And the first thing I do every time I get to a city that I'm less familiar with is I go to the river. And so I was down, I spent walked about 9 miles this morning, which I think now might not have been the best idea. I'm a little woozy and a little sunburned since the rain has cleared away. But I walked down along the Hudson, which I always find fascinating to see and be near. And every time I'm near a river in a different space, in a different urban agglomeration, in a different ecosystem, it reminds me of the questions of scale and questions of environmental sensibility that I am so that I've worked for so many years to build in my own mind, and hopefully in what readers I have in my own work. And so I say this all as a way of setting up what I think will be a very unfamiliar environment of the U.S. Mexico border today for many people in this room. But when I talk about the U.S. Mexico border, I do always like to take a show of hands just to kind of get a feel for what the familiarity is in the room. How many people in this room are from around the U.S. Mexico border? Oh, really? Where are you from?
California.
Okay, all right.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles. How many people have been to the U.S. Mexico border? All right. A few more. How many people are from, or parents are from, another country? Aha, now we're getting into it. So there is some border familiarity. There is a lot of familiarity with movement, with human movement across vast spaces, and inevitably not just across political boundaries, but also across environmental boundaries as well. And so I'm not going to talk that much about migration today, even though this is a migration series. But what I hope to do in lieu of that specifically is familiarize you in a few different ways with this set of spaces that we know as the U.S. Mexico border, that often functions as a proxy for larger conversations about immigration and migration in the United States. And so it is, for sure, as anyone who's crossed that border knows, to come to the United States. But it is also something more, something else outside of the realm of policy, of just a policy analysis. So what I want to talk about, as you can see from the title here, is the combination, the tension, the intersection between the natural and built environments of the U.S. Mexico border. Some of what we'll talk about, especially at the beginning, is going to be my previous work about construction projects on the U.S. Mexico Divide. And then toward the end, I'm going to pivot over and talk much more broadly about the non-human world, and not just the built environment, but the natural environment. I'll give you two examples of what I mean by that. So first, what I'm going to do is give you some of the key concepts from my book, explain a little bit about how I approach border geography, contemporary border geography. And by contemporary as a historian, I mean the past 165 years, not the past 7. I want to explain, or at least make a case for why I think it's important to distinguish between land borders and water borders, give you some examples of each. Then I want to shift gears and talk about my more current work in environmental history of deserts and how I approach that kind of geography. And in this case, I'm working on a time scale that is not in the 165-year range, but rather in the 12,000-year range. So it starts to get really weird. It starts to get very difficult to navigate. And I'll give you 2 examples of what I mean by that in the context of watersheds and in the context of ecological regions. And you'll know what those are if you don't already by the end of the talk. And what I want to leave you with overall is 3 larger concepts. I want to press you to think about how we organize territory, how we organize space, whether through its physical imposition or the imposition of the built environment on top of it, or in conjunction with it, or through a cartographic imaginary impulse. I want to challenge you to question how we think about time scale, how we organize chronological time, not just physical space. And then I want to say a few words throughout about the methods that we use to reconstruct the past in all of its forms. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples that I find very interesting. Before we get into it, I want to say something about this frontispiece photograph that I chose to open the talk with. What you're looking at here is a photograph taken in the context of the second and more or less definitive U.S. Mexico boundary survey in the 1890s. And what you're seeing, we're clearly on the land border, not the river border, because we're in the Sonoran Desert. And they are footing in, and by they, I mean this bilateral commission of both Mexican and American surveyors. They're footing a monument that is meant to say, this is where the border is. It's in a classicizing obelisk shape. The very tip top is where the international divide is, and then it's kind of half and half in both country. And what you can see from this, and the way I read this now, after having expanded my scope of analysis into a much, I guess, more pure environmental lens, is what we're seeing is a moment in time when the non-human world, call it the natural environment, completely overwhelms the political demarcation of the two countries. So yes, it's a border. Yes, there's a map. Yes, there's a survey marker. Should I admit this person, or is somebody else in charge of admitting people?
Someone else should be doing it.
Okay. Hi, hello, Zoom people, by the way. I'm glad that you're joining us virtually. So if we think about a balance between the non-human world and the human world, in this case, the non-human world is overwhelmingly dominant weight in that balance. Now, the exact opposite is true today, where the U.S. Mexico border is one of the most overbuilt spaces, string of mega projects, and not just fencing projects, but also hydraulic engineering projects, and also, and people forget about this, but just as important, just as expensive, just as invasive, highway projects and ports of entry projects that came out of the free trade agreement. So now the human built border, as even if you haven't been there, which most of you haven't, you know that anyway, right? That's just one of the things out there in the ether. It's like, we know about the U.S. Mexico border. However you feel about the fence, you know that there's a lot there. There's a lot of just human stuff, concrete and steel, demarcating an otherwise arbitrary environment. So let me start with this slide. This is the most common map of the U.S. Mexico border. It has the big border towns, a lot of the smaller border towns. It has the 6 Mexican states. It has the 4 U.S. states that comprise the political geography of the U.S. Mexico border. And to my mind, this map is almost completely useless in actually explaining anything to us about how the border actually is put together, how it actually functions. So we have no rivers, we have no highways, we have no real sense of how these cities and towns are connected with one another. We have no sense of the climate. And so this became my preoccupation in my first and only book, Borderland, Border Water. I kept a running tally as I was working through the manuscript with Marta, and I share an editor with Robert Devins at UT Press. And it was a list of not just the political place names, but also the mountain ranges and the deserts and the rivers and the reservoirs, the dams that I had written about. I just kept a list. And then I went to my genius map maker in the School of Architecture at UT. And there's a lot of UT people coming into this lecture, series if you've been here. So, shout out to everybody there. And I said, hey, Josh, can you fit all this stuff onto a single map and make it not a chaotic nightmare. And he said, well, let me see what I can do. And guess what? He did it. This map of the U.S. Mexico border, this is my book. This map of the U.S. Mexico border is the way I had always wanted to see it in all of its complexity, as an amalgamation of a series of unique places and spaces that that when you look at it in this register at this from this vantage, it becomes impossible to reduce the international divide between the U.S. and Mexico into the way that it is most typically talked about as the border, which for me, having grown up, let's see, right here, my question is always where of the border. And so so what we have is kind of I think about it as kind of a math problem. You have the political geography, political locations, which are the towns and cities, plus the natural features, and you can see the delineations of specific deserts here. So here's the Sonoran Desert, here's the Chihuahuan Desert, which is the focus of my current book. Obviously the river systems, which matter a lot, not least of which because most of the U.S. Mexico border is in fact a water border on the Rio Grande. And you add all that stuff up, including political developments, which is policy, which is immigration law, which is enforcement apparatus, funding, boots on the ground, all that kind of stuff. You put all this stuff together and you get something that looks in all of its complexity like a history of the U.S. Mexico border that feels satisfying and feels real to me as a set of places where people live, not just a set of policy apparatus through which many people have to pass on their way to some other place and from some other place. So I want to point out, while we still are on this slide, a couple of spots that I'm going to be talking about just to orient you. So I want to talk about Columbus, New Mexico, which is right here, and Paloma, Chihuahua, El Paso, Juarez, the ultimate border town complex right here, the mouth of the Colorado River right here, and then two big storage dams, Amistad and Falcon, for the Spanish speakers. So that's where we're going. First off, Columbus. So this is the land border, right? This is the border that does not acknowledge the natural landscape in any way, shape, or form in determining its trajectory or path. So you're looking at Columbus, New Mexico, right here. You're looking at this little town called Palomas in the state of Chihuahua in Mexico. You might think this is the border right here because it's very stark and it's clear on the landscape. It's not, it's the railroad. Those of you who know your railroad history know it's hard to overstate the importance of the railroads, especially for a lot of things, but definitely in terms of the delineation of the U.S. Mexico border. The border is somewhere right around here. In other words, it's not there. It's there in maps, it's there in official treaty documents between the two countries, but it doesn't actually exist on the land. The reason this photograph was taken in the late 1940s was in anticipation of building the first long distance border fence that we got, that really kind of peaked around 1951. This is very interesting. We're looking at an aerial oblique photograph in contrast to vertical aerials, which are harder to read, and we can talk about that if somebody really wants to geek out on kind of historical photo interpretation. But the reason this photograph was taken from a plane at an oblique angle was as part of a construction project. So there were ground teams that were down there on the land border, physically surveying the constitution of the soil, the rockiness, the sand. You all, I don't have to explain this to, to anybody in this room to know what kind of a site you're building on if you want to construct anything, even if it's a light fence. But then there were also these aerial reconnaissance surveys, and they put these things together in terms of maps, aerial oblique photographs, and then the ground surveys to construct the first long distance border fence, which what you're looking at here. So this is what we call the boot heel of New Mexico. Here is El Paso Juarez. This is where the river becomes the border. This is Palomas and Columbus. Now, let me say a few words about what you're looking at here. This map, this is a detailed map that I found in the National Archives Fort Worth branch. And you want, Sean, you want to get into agencies. So the International Boundary and Water Commission, which is a federal agency that nobody really cares about, but definitely should. I was looking for their documents for years and years in DC and in College Park, in like the main branches. And like, we don't really have construction documents over here. We don't really know where they are. What I find up in Fort Worth is just box after box after box, unopened, sent from the original agency. And their blueprints and their maps and their feasibility studies and their geological reports for every major border construction project that there was. And I thought to myself, this is pay dirt. This is a historian's dream. You get it maybe once, probably not at all in your entire lifetime. And I unfurled this kind of accordionized map of the entire U.S. Mexico, the western land border, the U.S. Mexico Divide. And I find in very precise detail where exactly this first border fence was built way earlier than we thought. 250 miles ultimately, complete with this lovely little key here about what kind of fencing it was. This was the Western Land Boundary Fence Project. What you will notice about this is that the vast majority of this fencing is barbed wire. And that is because the primary preoccupation about movement across the U.S. Mexico Divide in the 1940s and early 1950s was in fact infected cattle, foot and mouth disease. But thanks to the input of local immigration policing border guards, you find these small sections of chain link. So here's the red, small sections of chain link around Ambos Nogales, around Naco, around Douglas, and so on and so forth. And so you see the very, very beginning of what would ultimately become this, the border fencing project of recent years. And you see it on a very, very small scale and not spearheaded by federal level, like top-down policies or politicians, but rather by very, very, very local level border guards, where it's like, we just need some chain link fencing around this one port of entry, not so much to keep people out, but just to help us manage basically guest workers from Mexico at the time. And so I think looking at these, this early border fencing map helps us get a better sense of how wiggly the line has been in terms of border fences that leads up to the present day, but also how much more expansive the idea of barriers once were. And I think in this regard, the way I would put that slightly differently is to say that there is this animal history of the U.S. Mexico border. There is a non-human way of looking at border policies and the way that they affect other species. So another thing I want to say about this is that this, and this goes to sources for all you historians and archival researchers out there. You couldn't reconstruct this border through fieldwork. The imprint was too light. We're talking about very, very light chain link fencing. You can find all the gauges and everything, but very minimal, and then mostly barbed wire, which you could very easily confuse with just private fencing on all the ranches and ranch land on both sides of the border. And so here is an instance in which you find this very fascinating phenomenon that I find fascinating, which is the extent to which the built environment in the landscape acts as a mnemonic device that helps us remember this is what used to be there, but also the extent to which the erasure of that or the overbuilding of that also governs our imagination and our ways of seeing the world or not seeing the world, as the case may be. And so here is a way of looking at the built environment of the U.S. Mexico border that is strictly archival, of a world that doesn't exist anymore, a world that has been overwritten many times over. And so I find that to be not just something that we can learn about border fencing on the U.S. Mexico Divide, but also something we can learn about just the epistemological intricacies and surprises of archival methods more generally. Now here, this is where it starts to get difficult. You're looking at New Mexico, Chihuahua, Texas. More importantly, you're looking at, and this, by the way, is a topographic map series, Elephant Leos, published in 1901 to commemorate the final survey of the U.S. Mexico border. This is where it actually is, people. Easier said than done on water. Pretty easy to do at this point, 1890s, early 1900s on land. You're looking at a dead straight line of the western border. You might even confuse it with these lines of latitude. That's not an accident. It's actually drawn based on latitude, which is a made up thing, part of human convention, not in any way, shape, or form we just saw really rooted in the actual landscape. But right here, where it goes over, you can see this is a hill, these are the contour lines, this is Cristo Rey, we call it. It meets the Rio Grande, and then the Rio Grande takes over and becomes the international border. Now, already in this early image, you can see that the contrast between the rectilinearity of the latitude-derived land border and then the meandering of the Rio Grande. Now, if anybody knows this region of the US, southern New Mexico, you will recognize immediately that, whoa, that river doesn't look like that at all today. It's actually quite straight, and that's not an accident. These bends were cut out in the 1930s. Now, this is all well and good in the 19th century if you're trying to draw borders, to use natural features. That's what people did all over the globe. When in doubt, just use a river, close enough. By the end of the 19th century, when latitude and longitude were able to be very precisely calibrated, when property lines, not just international boundary, but property lines came to, when it came to be important to delineate property lines with extreme specificity, all of a sudden you realize that using a river as a border might be the worst idea you could possibly come up with by modern standards of political border precision. So to give you an example of what I mean by that, let's take a look. We're going west now over to the mouth of the Colorado. Look at this beautiful, beautiful map and look at this terrible border nightmare from the point of view of border builders. So to orient you, this is California, Baja California Norte, two, Arizona, and then Sonora, 4 borders. And then for this brief stretch of about 21 miles, the Colorado River is the U.S. Mexico Divide. Now, as you can see from this, what we call a meander map, this is a nightmare. This one of these maps was produced. This is another one from the 1901 topographic maps. So one of these maps was produced by the Mexican surveyors. Then a year later, the American surveyors come in and map the exact same part of the river. And lo and behold, in just 1 year, the river had moved that much. And so they kind of, called it, they decided, instead of trying to litigate yet another arbitration about the international divide, they decided, well, we'll just print both of them and worry about it later. But what you can see here is something very specific. Well, not specific, but something that is more exaggerated in desert rivers in particular. So to put this in comparison, the Rio Grande, the Colorado, this part of the Colorado, this is not, when I go out and look at the Hudson, I feel like I'm looking at an ocean. Like I feel like I'm looking at a shining sea, almost boundless in its scope. These are much smaller rivers, especially the Rio Grande, very shallow. It's running through sand for the most part, disarticulated earth, jumps its channel a lot. And in that context, what we find when the environmental conditions, these desert rivers, meets the 20th century political imperatives to cartographic precision, is we get this. So here we are back in El Paso. This is Juarez, Chihuahua. This is El Paso, Texas. This ribbon of infrastructure is the Rio Grande. Encased in concrete, straightened, had the bends cut out of it, aligned with railroad tracks, highways, eventually became essentially an open dumping ground for chemical, this is in heavy metals of all kinds, from the smelter on the U.S. side, from the maquilas on the Mexican side, from the various industries on the El Paso side. And it gets us to a situation in which the very nature of a desert river is upended. What I mean by that is we have this axiomatic truth in the desert that you've probably heard in one form or another, because it's not just exclusively a desert thing. And that is, well, water's life. In very, very dry environments, you find that surface water, rivers, streams, such as they exist, are these magnets for everything from microbiotic to macrobiotic forms of life. And when you encase and channelize and rectify, that is, straighten a river like this, you essentially turn it completely on its head, and it turns into a space of death. And then on top of that, as we probably all know, it becomes incorporated into the policing apparatus of migration and contraband policing, such that the river that was once just flowing becomes another tool in the arsenal of policing. We can talk more about how that works structurally if you want in the Q&A. But sticking now to this question of water and to how border water has been managed This is an example of a river being made to hold still to serve the interests of a political divide. These are two examples of a river being completely transformed through storage dams. And so what we're looking at here, again, aerial oblique photographs. So in this way, in this sense, they have that in common with the land border construction projects. Low-flying planes, doing these passes around the feasibility sites or the feasibility studies, and then subsequently to the actual construction of the cofferdams here, and then finally the full the full dam here. This is what would become Amistad Dam. This is Falcon. So I think that there's a couple things I want to say about these images. One, they are best understood not as border phenomena, but rather as part of the massive hydraulic transformation of the entire American West, and by extension, the entire Mexican North. The fact that they're on the international divide is kind of incidental insofar dry lands, semi-arid and arid places throughout. And in this case, it matters, right? The Mexican North has a lot in common climatically and environmentally with the many parts of the American West, another arbitrary divide between the two borders or between the two just spaces. And so these are some of the most profound alterations of the water border, but they are quite average in the context of the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of river projects and damming enterprises in both countries over the let's say 1920s to 1950s. But as a border phenomenon, they are very strange and counterintuitive, because what you can't see here, because it's not done, but when it gets done, these dams are half in the United States and they're half in Mexico. They're built half by Mexican engineers, half by American engineers. All the documentations are bilingual in both Spanish and English. And you would think, and as far as I can tell, is the case, that they are shining examples of physical, political, and intellectual collaboration between the two countries, which completely upends our inherited and kind of cliched expectations about the U.S. Mexico border as a space of conflict and rancor, which it also is. But this is what we get when we drill down into the specificity of individual projects. We get these different ways of thinking about it. Now, there is also something very, another kind of ambiguous aspect to these storage dams on the U.S. Mexico divide that do not fit in to the larger history of hydraulic engineering in the American West and the Mexican North. And that is, these were not electrical power. They had penstocks in them, like they're making electricity, and it kind of goes off in both directions. So both the Americans and the Mexicans get some of the power, but these were mainly flood control dams. In other words, through the deep-seated assault on the watershed, very delicate, very fragile watershed, many border people on both sides of the line were delivered from a very bad history of flooding. And I think that more and more people, as we all know, and probably I'm sure that some people in this room have had very close, way too close for comfort experiences with floods. And man, there's nothing more terrifying than water out of control. And you realize very quickly how little power we have as an organism in the face of that. And so I think about these dams as hard sites. It's not easy to read the grand narratives of the U.S. Mexico border about conflict and about environmental degradation through these dams. Oh, here's my grad student, Paul. Let's let him in. Let's let him in. Whoever's in charge of the admin. So let me tell you. Let me tell you about how I figured all this stuff out. I told you about the boxes, but guess what else I found in the boxes? I found documents like this. This is a list revised in 1981, prepared by or for, I'm not sure who, or not sure what, the commissioner of the International Boundary and Water Commission, this relatively obscure agency. By the way, this is another thing that's interesting about these border projects. So there's the International Boundary and Water Commission, and then there is the exact equivalent in Mexico. That's how they work together. Now, you look up every other federal agency in the US, except the BLM, that would not Black Lives Matter, but the Bureau of Land Management. This from people from the West, you have to explain this when you're not in the West. All the US federal agencies are headquartered in DC. All the Mexican federal agencies are headquartered in Mexico City. No surprise there. We're both federal systems. But the International Boundary and Water Commission has its headquarters in El Paso, Texas. And the SILA, the Mexican version of that, has its headquarters in Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, right across the road. And so there's a physical proximity. This matters a lot, to have a physical proximity between these two agencies. Yeah, they're bureaucracies. Yeah, they're federal. Yeah, we all know bureaucracies are hard to get things done. But when you're that close together physically, you actually know each other. You can talk to each other. You can be in these physical spaces together. So that's very interesting, and it's very important. This is one of the commissioners of the U.S. section of the Boundary and Water Commission. And take a look at this. Is there a way, by the way, that we can take the stuff off the screen? Whoever's in charge of the computer? Am I in charge of it?
I think you can just access, yeah. Quite an audience.
Oh, there it goes. There it goes.
The X and that transcript thing will go on.
Yeah.
Can you do that?
I don't have it.
All right.
This is just happening magic. Someone's doing it. So thank you, whoever's doing that. Okay, look at this, people. This is not that hard to put together a book like mine. When you have documents like this that basically draw you chapter and verse, a roadmap of every single construction project on the U.S. Mexico border. When I found this document, I was like, this is it. This is the way in to a border history that is different from other border histories. Those of you who are grad students, those of you who are going to be grad students, this is a question you're going to be asked. The farther along you get, hey, how is your work different than all the other work that's kind of related to it? You have to come up with a good answer for that question, so you get a seat at the table and get to stay in the conversation. And so this is a 100-some page document. There's entries for all these in the document that just explains all the details, and that's in large part how I reconstructed what I did. Of course, this ends, as you can see here, in 1981. I go through construction projects all the way to like 2010s, but it's not that hard to then recreate and to build out the chronology there. So what do you miss though if you're focused like I was on the international divide? One thing you miss, as I found, is thinking so narrowly about the political line that I missed the fact that the river itself goes all the way up into what's now Colorado and in fact has many tributaries. Actually, most of the water down in South Texas and the Delta is coming from Mexican tributaries, the Conchos, the San Juan Salado. And what you can see here from this map, which is not mine, are all the different dams, diversion dams and storage dams on the upper part of the watershed that have nothing whatsoever to do with the U.S. Mexico Divide. In other words, the hydraulic history here is, if you're just looking at the border at these two dams, Amistad and Falcon, you're really missing the bigger picture. And what if then you take a step back beyond that and say, well, actually, what if we just delete or look beyond or look underneath the human imprint of the watershed and just think about the shape of the watershed itself as an exercise in breaking free of the ossification of hardened political boundaries, which, whether we like it or not, whether we want to or not, is structuring our imaginations, is structuring our sense of space and the meaning of territory. And so I find it very liberating to think about shapes like this, the watershed set off as its own shape that that has its own internal logic. Watershed simply meaning that's where the water runs down to, and kind of and has its own like topographic logic. Another way to think about that is through ecological regions. This is a map produced or published by the Environmental Protection Agency. It was the painstaking work of scores of various scientists in Canada, Mexico, and the United States. You can see the Canadian part here. To come up with definitions of, all right, what would in fact coherent ecological regions be? Like, how would we put boundaries around those to begin with? And so it's all well and good to say, as many of us who work on borders do, borders are abstract, we give them meaning, we give them a physical imprint on the land, but they're really passing through these other environments with their own internal logic. And here we can see, and of course, you know, these are just names. They're not, they're other forms of abstraction, but there is something to be said, I think, about the way I think about it, the kind of the out there-ness of ecological regions. Whether we name them or not, whether we make maps about them or not, there's something internally coherent about these spaces. And so this shape here is the Chihuahuan Desert. That is the subject of my current book. What does it mean to tell a desert history? It can't just be another border history in the desert. I wanted to get it to something deeper. What would it mean to structure a narrative about the past without taking undigested the political categories that we've been given, and instead ask the non-human world for parameters? Now, this is where it starts to get very weird. And the list that I showed you of the different border projects, that's easy. It's a list. They have dates. You can very precisely date infrastructure projects. You can date when the ground was broken. You can date how long it took to construct them. You can guess pretty accurately at how long the life cycle will be until the metal starts to rust and the concrete starts to fail, and when we're going to have to do new renovations of all these kinds of dams. And you can get a very concrete, no pun, well, maybe pun intended, you can get a very good handle on those kinds of projects. This, well, one way to do it is to think through indigenous origin stories, which I'm not going to talk about today, but if somebody wants to talk about that, we can. It's very interesting. Sticking for the purposes of the talk today to set up a contrast with the documents I just showed you from the Fort Worth archive. I want to show you these graphs that are radiocarbon dates retrieved from pack rat middens in 2 different sites, Maravillas Canyon Cave and Rio Grande Village in Big Bend National Park in part of West Texas. These are very complicated images to look at, and I don't expect you to automatically understand what you're seeing, and we don't have to go through it in graphic detail. But let me just explain to you what it is you're looking at. You're looking at here on the y-axis dates that go back here to 27,000 years, and here that go back 45,000 years. So the absolute limit of carbon-14 dating. And then what you have in all these different slots are different plant species. And as you can see, some of the plant species grow very, very deep in time. Others of them start to grow in much more recent time. And what you're seeing here is really the end of the last ice age. And so you're able to reconstruct paleo environments according to the terms of those environments themselves, at least insofar as we're talking about plant assemblages. Flora, less so fauna, starts to get, once you start getting reptiles involved, you don't want to get reptiles involved. It complicates things. My point here is just to say that, and I guess I will close with a few thoughts about what my point is to say. I am not optimistic about the immediate future of the U.S. Mexico border. I don't like the developments that have taken place there in the past 20 years. I don't like a lot of the building projects that took place before that for a range of reasons. But we know, I feel like I know from just the record of humanity. And this is one of the inclinations I have developed. As I go deeper into the past, I become more interested in also going deeper into the future. And I imagine that at some point, the U.S. Mexico border will cease to exist. I don't know if that will be a cataclysmic thing. I don't know if that will be, I don't know what that will look like, but insofar as every delineation of political territory that humans have ever devised have altered themselves, have changed over time, I expect with a fair amount of certainty that so will the U.S. Mexico border. And I take solace in thinking that far outside the chronological scope in which we're most familiar, a lifetime or two. I take solace in thinking outside the geographical and territorial boundaries that have been handed to us, in many cases against our will. These are what nation states are. These are what political boundaries are. We all have to act accordingly. And I find the move into the non-human world to be a solace in how I just experience my own path through life, insofar as it's a relief to imagine narratives in which human beings are not at the dead center and assumed to be intrinsically the most important and the most interesting, which is not, of course, to say that like human condition doesn't matter, but to say that other things also matter. So I hope that I've left you with some useful interpretations of the U.S. Mexico Divide, with which only a handful of you are personally familiar. I hope that I've prompted you to, in your own context, in your own work, whether that's whatever that might be, to to push or at least question orthodoxies that are received. And I am now really looking forward to having conversation and taking any questions you might have. Thank you very much. Yeah.
When you spoke about having these dams full filled by Mexican engineers and American engineers, and then whatever power was ever made, besides the fact that they were there for the flood, were there ever any conflict if the powers ever split evenly between the borders?
Yeah, there was a little bit. There's a little bit. I think in one case, Mexicans actually got more power. I mean, you might have heard that there was a terrible, terrible catastrophe in Texas last year where there was a freeze that we're not used to, and the grid basically failed. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but the Texas interconnection is not an interconnection. It's it's bounded within the state of Texas. Whereas like we're connected here in New York all the way to the Mississippi practically or the western. So we can move power between those grids in Texas. So there are these transmission lines that go back and forth across the U.S. the Texas Mexico border and across other state borders, but not in any like measurable way. And so I don't think it's like perfectly 50-50 in terms of the power generation. But I think that is really like the bottom of the list of people's like what we need to worry about on the U.S. Mexico border. And I think that those two agencies are better equipped to just navigate one another than any other kind of mirror agencies in the U.S. Yeah.
Is there any sort of agency between the U.S. and Mexico to redefine the border and Texas centric?
Yeah. So this is one of the most interesting things to me about studying not just borders, but studying the evolution of borders. And if I can generalize for a second, say that the evolution of, I think, borders more generally in the 20th century, but certainly the U.S. Mexico border in particular, is one of increasing fixity, increasing hardness. So if you were to go back to the 19th century, or back to even the Spanish period in the 18th century, you were to ask a random person like, what do you think the chances like these borders are going to move? 50-50. We're used to borders moving in the age of empires and in the age of like these massive nation states. We are not used to that now. So much so that the idea of in a meaningful way shifting territory, acreage or hectareage between the United States and Mexico is, to my mind at least, unthinkable. And that's very interesting, and that's very recent. That this conviction that we have, that the borders that we have are here to stay, reinforces our conviction, our subconscious conviction that they're real and that they should be there, whether we're like however we're opposed to them or not. I will say one more thing, that, and this I was very surprised to find in the archives, but there were these little movements in the Rio Grande over the course of the 20th century that created like many little arbitrations between Mexico and the U.S. And that wasn't fully settled. I mean, the border, like, let's pin it down to the millimeter until the 1970s because the land assassin. So it took an extraterrestrial space age set of technology to finally impose a 20th century sense of order on this 19th century desert river that we have been demanding you double duty for 165 years. So, yeah. Yeah, I'll let it back.
How did the California drought affect your
The California droughts?
Yeah,
Well,
and the reliance like on the Colorado River.
Yeah. So. If you were to go back to the 1870s, you would find this guy named John Wesley Powell, that you might have heard of, who did one of the big Western surveys for the U.S Geological Survey. And he came back and gave his report to Congress. And he said, hey, U.S Congress, you haven't made states yet in the West. It's still territorial and amorphous. You should make states according to watersheds, because that's going to be the main issue in this very, very dry place in the American West. You can find his map online. It's totally open accessible. You can see like, oh, that's a totally different, way of looking at the West. Now, if you picture in your mind's eye a map of the US West today, it ain't that. In fact, you put the square, like straight lines, basically the worst case scenario. So that's bad enough in terms of all the different states wanting Colorado River waters, especially during times of drought and increasing urban use in the West. But like you saw in the, in this map here, it also goes into Mexican territory. And in particular, the cotton growers in Mexicali, one of the northern border towns on the Mexican side, lobbied very hard for a water treaty that was signed in 1944 that guaranteed a certain number of acre feet to the Mexicans. The same thing with the Rio Grande, but that was signed in 1906. So the back and forth with water treaty law between Mexico and the United States has been, unlike the power generation question we talked about, has been like very, very tense and very unpleasant over the years in all kinds of different ways. I would add one more thing to that. We have no treaty law for subsoil water. So there are aquifers that span the border. And my colleague at Texas A&M, Rosario Sanchez, has mapped them all miraculously. And she's very, very interesting. And it's a very, very interesting project. But that's going to be, if you're thinking about climate change and drought, that's going to be the next stage in border bilateral environmental and infrastructural relations, is groundwater pumping, who gets what from subsoil resources, especially in these dry lands, and where is it, and how much is it, and is it saline or not, and just all the different issues that come with groundwater stuff. So it's mad. Yeah, come on.
Isn't the term of speculation, right? How do you think global warming and environmental changes would like reshape the Mexican American border? So like satisfy the need of water between Mexico and the United States.
Well, kind of like what I just said, I think that's part of the answer. I think that getting back to this question of like very, very deep time scale. So for most of human history, we didn't have the engineering or technological capacity to fundamentally confront and believe we might actually conquer the forces of the non-human world. So if there's one story about hydraulic engineering in the 20th century, it is the belief that we can, through building, conquer a very difficult environment, deserts and versatility. We can make, in the words of like the boosters of this, we can make the desert blue. We can turn the desert into real environment, forests and agricultural zones that are drained there, etc. Another way to think about that is to say that we have, there's a set of conquests that the dominant narrative of American history believes it has achieved, but has not. There was the belief that somehow we conquered, that somehow the United States had conquered the people, the indigenous people who were living here. It has not. Right? It's one of the reasons why we do land acknowledgements, because the indigenous people are still here. There was the belief that we conquered the natural world. We did not. The desert is still there, and we're starting to see the cracks in the in the facade of the very like hubristic, very bullish hydraulic engineering ideology of like the 1920s. It's like nothing can stop us. We're going to control every aspect of this. And so one of the things I wonder about when I think in the deep future about the reorientation of political borders is there going to be a 200-300 year blip in human history where we had just enough technology to mask environmental conditions, but not fundamentally change them? And as such, draw arbitrary straight lines and, across like otherwise integral environments. And will the new reconfiguration of political space snap back in one way or another to be more, I want to say in sync, as that implies a kind of stewardship, maybe that won't happen, but more coincident with the natural world. I don't know.
I want to geek out with you on images for a moment.
Get into it.
A little tangential to the talk, but so we talked a little bit about photographic mediation. Do you know anything about like the physical handling and circulation of like the photographs, maps, and diagrams? Are they just bureaucratic paperwork that land in archives? Do they have other audiences?
So I'm a border person, right? Grew up there, four generations, like on the U.S. Mexico border, which by New Mexico standards is like a newcomer. People go back 30 generations, in New Mexico. But one of the things I struggled with as I was putting together the book is I'm like, how do I represent, right, the border, or present it for the first time in a way that doesn't fall into like cliche images, in a way that feels like fresh to like border as well. So this is the answer to your question. All of these documents, almost all of the documents that I published in the book, were internal documents. And so my hope was that border people like me, who think they get it, think they know, they know about it, could pick up the book and be like, I have never seen anything like this before. Because I had when I saw these images. And I talk about this a little bit in the book, but I think this is a very interesting, another interesting aspect of the archive, and that is, what does it, to me, it was very interesting and important to show the archive to non-bureaucrats, non-construction work, non-engineers, just like non-border. And Robert told me to do it, like, let me do it and let me publish 53 images. Sorry, that's great. Yeah.
Catherine's editor too.
And yeah,
Yeah, so I have many questions,
yeah, good for it.
but I'll start with, I'll go even further. I just heard that the U.S. Mexico Border exists. I will go even further. I don't think it exists anymore. I think that the flows that already exist, the aquifers, the environment, the people, the aspirations, everything, that it cannot be denied anymore. That's my guess. However, in that sense, the wall that exists right now is the physical manifestation of that border, and it takes a lot of money to actually build it. And it takes a lot of money in terms of security, in terms of surveillance, helicopters, you name it. So I have a question of, is there a true reason why the wall keeps existing, even if that takes a lot of money on the US, a lot of money on the Mexico? I think that there are many things that affect negatively, not only the people, but also the environment, the land, both countries.
Yeah.
I mean, my guess is that it's xenophobia rather than, but I would like to know what are the thoughts.
Well, we're in it now, people. We're talking, we're into the border fence. We're into the and we had to come here eventually. So let me say a few things about this, then you can tell me if I answered your question, if you feel satisfied about that, because I want to just, I don't want to dodge it, but I want to just kind of frame it, put it in context, because I'm guessing, you know, you're not the only person in the room who like wants to have some insight into this. Important fact number one. Everything about the barrier mega projects from 2006, when the Secure Fence Act was passed, in bipartisan, right, passed into law in the Bush administration up until the present day. Everything about that fence construction has been federal politician driven. That stands in very stark contrast with all the early border fencing and border security kinds of initiatives, with the exception of Mexican Revolution, which Mexicans, we can get into that if you want, but in the, like the map I showed you up here, the earlier projects have been like very local. So we need to control, we need to somehow manage like these guest workers, not to keep them out, but just to check their paperwork, whatever, or animals, etc. So that's one big difference. In part, I think your question is kind of rooted in, well, it doesn't really make sense, it doesn't make fiscal sense. So why would we do something that doesn't make fiscal sense? Well, we do anyway. I think in one way, you kind of answered your own question. I think the border fence thing continues precisely because it doesn't work. And it falls into work, meaning like keep people out, right? It's a never-ending self-fulfilling prophecy where if anyone you don't want coming in, then therefore you need to build more fencing. And then if no one is coming in that you don't want, you still have to build more fencing, and you still have to, you know, increase policing, because that means it's working. We have to keep it working that way. But I think you're right to point out that its value lies in its rhetorical dimension. Because don't forget, this is the point I make in the last chapter of my book, it was definitely not a, you know, list in the archives, that there was not one, but two mega projects taking place on the U.S. Mexico border in the past 30 years. One was barrier infrastructure, and the other was the infrastructure of connectivity. The other one was 15, 20 new bridges across the river between Texas and the various Mexican states on the other side, increased density of asphalt, very expensive to hold heavier trucks for overland traffic, increased expansion of lanes and checkpoints, not to keep people out, but to facilitate trusted traders in the context of the NAFTA. And so, so I will have border fence conversations with whoever wants to have those conversations with me, but I demand that they take place, and I'm talking about like a broader world, but I demand that they take place also in the context of the rest of the building project took place at the same time that emphasized the exact opposite thing. And so when you put it in that context, in the context of the built environment, it becomes much, much easier to see the primacy of that rhetorical, that rhetorical dimension of let's build it, let's build it, let's build it. Does that answer your question?
I think yes, we have many interesting things.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the pack rat.
Thanks.
I googled it just to see what it was. I never heard of that, but I have a little fascination on paleobotany. So I'm guessing this is going into your future work.
Yeah.
But in this deep geological time, and I'm interested in this complex of plants and geology that those fossils reveal. What are you thinking about these plants, which are maybe no longer with us, or perhaps in return? I'm just curious where you're going with the question of paleobotany.
All right, hang on, people. We're gonna get into some paleobotany here, which might not be what you signed up for this series in migration and School of Architecture, but stick with me and see what you make of it. I'm very interested in, I think when you study lists of things, and when you study concrete steel, and you study individual projects, you get very accustomed to thinking in discrete units of time and space. And part of what I'm doing in the Desert Project is trying to push myself out of that. And so there's a couple of payoffs, I think. That one is the idea that the given landscape that we see, a floristic landscape that is assemblages of plants, is just that, it's assemblages. And so I was under the misapprehension my entire life, growing up in the desert, that like that's what the desert is. It's these things. But it turns out that some of the species I was looking at, in fact, were what are called relict with a T species, left over from a previous era of Pleistocene. But it still exists. And then some of them are new. And so at the same time, you are looking not at the individual level, but at the assemblage level, at very young plants, and very, very ancient plants. And so this scrambled my idea of fixity that I had become accustomed to in the context of the fire. Also, temporally. I asked the first question that I have been trained to think and ask as a historian, and that is, when did the desert, like, what's the origin of the desert? When did it come into existence? That's a very linear question. It's a very chronology-based question. What I learned is the wrong question to ask. So what I'm playing with right now, this like manuscript, maybe we'll become a book one of these days when I figure it all out. So I'm playing around like, what does a historian do with a subject and a space that resists the very concept of beginning? Where that do to our sense of the historical record, time, how we see ourselves in workplaces, by the way, species, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk and your time. Question regarding, I don't know how to put it, that like your historical perspective on the evolution of the precision of the border, the technological and material precision, and how that interplays with the politics of belonging, to name it in a way. I was very impressed or shocked by one of your first maps, the map of like the border for the cattle, that had this very thick line and where actually some like little towns fell on the line. So I was wondering what, literally put one town or one territory where human beings live on one side or the border or other, but as soon as the technology of precision makes that line more precise, as you explained to us, how that interplayed with the social politics of, the belonging of who lives there, how, that, for example, that the precision changes your status of belonging or things like that.
Yeah. So some of you might be from other border regions in the world. And you will know what I'm talking about when I say that sometimes you have human settlements that have a very long history, and then at some point in their existence, some force like drew a border through them or near them, and then everybody had to like become border people, whether they liked it or not. More commonly on the U.S. Mexico border, the human settlements arose because of the existence of the U.S. Mexico border. And that had to do almost invariably with some kind of trade, in some cases labor, but mostly like agricultural exchange. So we have cotton here, we have winter fruit here, has to go there. So we actually, I mean, you find in the archives, Mexican business people and growers like begging for new ports of entry. So like, look, if you want us to do this the right way, and we can just go across whenever you want, but if you want us to do it the right way, we don't want to drive like 5 hours one way and then cross the border and then come all the way back. So we want more ports of entry, and then little towns, kind of grow out of that, and then sometimes become big towns. So I think that's part of it. I think to your technological question, I think what is important for me in teaching and in my own work is to constantly ask and re-ask myself, is what I'm seeing a border phenomenon, or is it part and parcel of some other broader phenomenon? You're right to say that in many ways, the hardening of the U.S. Mexico border is part of the history of technology, of mapping technology, of surveillance technology, of engineering technology. But those technologies have applications in a much broader context in Mexican society and American society as well. And so insofar as the border, through its technological apparatus, is reifying difference, those technologies might also be reifying difference in internal contexts as well. So the classic example coming out of like Carl Wittfogel's work, those of you who really want to geek out, this is debatable, but the idea is like, when you have a hydraulic society, right, in which few resources, this kind of goes back to your question as well, which few resources are controlled through engineering prowess and development, then that lends itself towards social inequality. Because how then, how is that like equitably distributed? There's of course all kinds of variations on this. But so I think that there are aspects of the border specific technologies that then do kind of what you were suggesting earlier, just kind of, yeah, it's the, if the question is like, is the border like a racist space? Yes, it is, right? The cat's out of the bag. It absolutely is. The deeper question is like, specifically how does it reify that? And are there other instances that are not border specific that also reify that? And is the border, is our credulity in a political division masking these other forms of inequality that we might see spinning out of the same technologies in non-border context? Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
No, yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. So I'm gonna ask a question for the designer in the room.
Yeah, please.
About the representation of labs. The reason I ask is sort of going off your idea that you're going to draw something on the paper, it becomes real. Then we're gonna find ways to make it real if it's not real in the first place. And I wonder, in your research, have you come across any interesting representation of boundaries that is dynamic, that is not a solid, line, or because we know, the other, but there's still solid lines.
Yes.
Right? Because also, for example, when we draw a boundary, like coastal area, we know, that line doesn't represent the exact tidal fluctuation of a coastal area. So do you have any suggestions for us as designers who want to draw things that are not a solid line?
Oh, thank you so much for that question. That's one of these questions. But first of all, I am not trained in any of this stuff. So it is like such a great honor for me to be here among people who know a lot more about so many. I just went to the archives, found some, images and wrote about them. Like, I'm not an architectural historian, like per se. I'm definitely not an architect. And I'm definitely not a designer, but I have this background in art history. I think, these images are so important for that reason. I'm working on a mini essay right now that I think might come out the Broken Rail. So to be continued on that, about this map in particular, because if anything, has blurry lines, it's ecological regions. It's the idea of the ecotone, the transition zone, right? When you're on the ground, you know this intuitively. In the lengthy methodological explanation by the scientists of how they made these maps, they actually address that question directly. And they basically say, yeah, we're using lines out of convention, but like nobody believes they're basically compromised, because like the soil scientists are like, no, this is where the line is, and then the botanists are like, no, this is where the line is. I'm like, all right, let's just make this as a compromise. And so there's actually a quote that I can't remember verbatim. Basically, they say, yeah, the lines on the map are more of an art than a science. We're using that like a colloquial sense. So basically, they didn't try to solve the problem, but they made maps that were not mainly, but largely like internally circulated, in which the audience of those maps got it, understood that this map is more of an abstraction than anything else. And I think that your question is very, very important, because if you're not in that conversation, then it's very easy to look at a map like this and say, oh, this is real, just like political borders are real. We should all kind of act accordingly. I will say one other quick thing about this, and this has to do with publication. This is a real problem. Chances are you're going to have to be publishing in grayscale. And so I had to think about this a lot in the, like this is not going to work because the contrast isn't, there's too much going on. This wouldn't look like nonsense, black and white. And so part of the best we could do, going all the way back to to this one, which had to be in grayscale, for the publication of the book, was just to kind of, make the deserts based a little dark. But of course, that's just because those are the deserts that I was referencing, not to be a totalizing thing. I think another thing to do is to, in terms of like line weight and just density, it's helpful to put the global borders on so people aren't totally lost. But emphasize the rivers more than like just really make it very, very light. That's what we try to do here. It's like just very like kind of whispers in the background so you don't get lost in the map. But the other features are more pronounced. But that's another partial solution. Does that help?
I think we have time for one more question.
There's a student.
Students?
I'm curious of your thoughts, speaking about the unreality of borders. At the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, there are moments where there are still sort of meanders in ways where the U.S. Mexico oozes into the U.S.
Oh yeah.
U.S. oozes into Mexico. They're only like a couple hundred feet apart.
Yeah.
From one side of the United States to the other of Mexico to Mexico. But when you go down to the Sciame River, is a completely different phenomenon where at times Mexico is on one side of the river and sometimes on the other side and switches with Guatemala. So it's a curious how these two rivers and borders, that dance between the two, how they differ so radically.
Yeah. It is. I mean, I think again, we take for granted also, especially here in the East, the extent to which we still use rivers like state boundaries, between different states, which is again a very 19th century phenomenon. And so these straight line borders at all that now we find in the Middle East, we find, certainly in the American West, the Canadian West, and so on and so forth, are much newer inventions they are inventions, I should say, rather than these like Argentinian frontiers, these natural boundaries. But some of that stuff is left over, you know, so we deal with it. But there are these very, you know, there are plenty of places on the U.S. Mexico border where the border is actually east-west, not north and south, you know, just depending on where you are in Texas. And so I guess what I would say that we learned from rivers is two things. What I learned from is we learn to question the premises of these modern borders. And we also, I hope, I try to emphasize this as much as I can whenever I can, that rivers are rivers first and borders second. And they will be rivers again. And it's very easy to forget that. And I had so much trouble when I was trying to do deeper environmental research to this. I'm like, I want a history of the Rio Grande. And I found all these books, and I'm like, well, this is actually a legal history. It's just treaty law. It's nothing to do with, like, the river is incidental. Or like, oh, this is a, you know, a dam building, you know, kind of a treatise or whatever. It's nothing to do with, like, it's the river is incidental. And so that's one of the sparks that got me asking, like, what does it actually mean to write river history that isn't just stuff we did to rivers history? And that's kind of what prompted me to think, well, first thing you have to do is like look at the river. And once you start doing that, it goes beyond the border in one way or another.
Well, I think that's a great way to end. Yeah.
Can you remind me of the name of the cartographer, the map?
Oh, yeah. John.
Just look up John.